continuing the stream after what happened last time. What happened last time is that it cut off without warning. But yep, I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully as well it won't cut off this time. Had to restart. Also, I will occasionally be checking on chat if anyone has any questions for us, feel free to ask, please. I'm happy to answer them. Anyway, so back to where we were from before. So this is the waterline, what the waterline would have been as boat 1 began to pull away. As you can see here, these portholes are going under, as recalled by George Simmons, that the portholes were going underneath the nameplate, were going away as they got away from the ship, like rowing away. However, boat 5, one survivor called Anna Warren mentioned that just going to shut the door quickly, that as their boat lowered, that she looked through the portholes on D-deck as they reached for water. The problem is, though, is that the Titanic wouldn't have at all moved, basically, like, unless, though I suppose she might have been standing up in the boat, which would explain it, as they pulled away. But yeah, so it would mean that the Titanic wouldn't have at all moved. I mean, she was sinking very, very slowly at that point, but it would not have hardly at all moved, basically. So yeah, even the listing basically wouldn't have at all affected the position the ship was in. That's what the case would have had to have been. So yeah, I mean, but my idea is that maybe as their boat lowered past the deck, she looked through the portholes, and then it reached water shortly afterwards, maybe 30 seconds later, and therefore she confused this as having happened when they reached for water. Anyway, their boat pulled away from the Titanic a bit, along with boat 7. They pulled away for a bit and watched the Titanic go down before pulling away even further. So I'm just gonna just move the boat a bit. But yeah, so estimates of the distance also vary between survivors, basically. But this is what the Titanic, like, ignoring, like, the stern, basically. But this is how it might have seemed like the position that Titanic was in after they'd pulled away to a certain distance. So, also, something else to talk about before we talk about boat 10 and the V-break afterwards is that just going to quickly check that I'm still live after what happened last time. Oh yeah, I'm still live. Hasn't at all stopped streaming. Okay, so anyway, basically, the next interesting note out of those in boat 60 mentioned no list of those at boat 12 mentioned a slight list. Basically, so there being slight port list, I would say, of about 1.5 degrees to port when their boat left. However, an interesting thing to talk about, though, is that boat 14 on the Titanic, their occupants, well, the occupants of boat 14 and several on board noted there being a port list. Officer Lowe said their boat was 3 feet from the side, and he mentioned this was during the shooting at A deck. Their boat was 3 feet from the side, basically, which would be about a 6-7 degree list to port, basically. So this would have to have been when the Titanic was starting to list over heavily to port, which would be about the time as well, about the same time as like when boats 13 and 15 were leaving as well. But the Titanic probably wasn't listing too heavily to port when boat 13 reached water, just 12 point, just about 2.5 degrees, because their boat had no problem like getting away with the list base. They didn't all find it difficult to get away with, even though there was a list. However, those at boat 14 mentioned, so Frank Morris mentioned that he thought there was a port list in the inquiries. Fred Scott said he went to the highest side where she had a list, which was starboard, meaning that there was a list to port. Officer Lowe said they were 3 feet to the side, also indicating a list to port. Cecil Fitzpatrick also mentioned a list to port, and Charlotte Collier and Esther Hart also said there was a list to port when they got off. That implied it anyway, because they said their daughters were thrown into boat 14, which means there would have been a list to port. Basically, there would have had to have been a list to port. But anyway, so and also, however, though, those at boat 9 said that there was no list, which is also corroborated by those at boat 16. The reason that boat 9 has been originally thought to have left after boat 14 is because one survivor on board the boat, Joseph Scarrett, said that he saw another survivor, George McGough, before their boat left, manning the falls. McGough left in boat 9, which would suggest at first that boat 9 left, after 14. However, well, it was also thought to have left before boat 12, but which was testified by John Poindexter. However, others seem to suggest boat 12 left before boat 14, so John Poindexter might have confused it with another boat, basically, that left before, maybe boat 16, which had left before, or might have thought it left, boat 14 left earlier. Several on board boat 12 and on deck as well said that boat 12 left before boat 4. However, well, plus as well, Walter Nichols said that took 15 minutes to load boat 15 and that 10 to return to boat 15 after 13 and 11 were gone. We know those boats didn't leave that far apart, but since it took 20 minutes to load, this suggests there must have been at least, since he didn't mention boat 9, there must have been a gap of at least 20 minutes between the departures of 9 and 15. And if boat 9 left at 1:30, which would be accepted as 5 minutes after 14, if it left at 1:25 as commonly accepted, then this would mean that boat 15 left at 1:50 basically, which would then mean that the port list began much later into the sinking than originally thought to have. Instead starting at starting to list really heavily at 1:50. basically, which wasn't mentioned by those at boat 15. However, mentioned that the propellers were out of water when they left, which would imply a timing of about 1:45. Well, that when they were rowing away, they saw the propellers partially out of the water. So therefore, plus as well, it would also mean that if more likely Joseph Scout was probably mistaken, basically, because his testimony does have a few questionable things. One, they said there was a starboard list till water reached the bridge, which contradicts every account about a heavy port list. He also said he didn't talk about a breakup in the inquiries, but mentioned there was a breakup in a later newspaper testimony. Basically, so more likely he might have just confused George McGough with another seaman, another crew member. Also, considering how dark it was that night, so that can be accounted for. Because therefore, see, that's why I think 9 left after 14, and plus as well. Well, otherwise it also had to have meant that boat 50 left 25 minutes after 14. If 9 left 5 minutes after 14. And also, another thing it would have to have meant is that the Titanic kept on listing to port and returning to an even keel, basically, and plus more survivors should have mentioned it if it happened, in my opinion. So therefore, that's why I think boat 40 left afterwards. The final key frame that we have to look at. So therefore, you see, I think that boat 16 left at about 120, then boat 12 left at 125, and then boat 14 left at some time between 125 and 140, leaving them there as a 6-degree port list, which would have also been around the time of boats 16 and 13. So now we're going to talk about boat 10. So first we have to list, we're going to list the bow to about 10 degrees and angle it down. So this is the waterline, the time of boat D leaving. However, the waterline when boat 10 left is, well, it's up for debate when boat 10 left, and research is still ongoing into this. Thing is, you see, however, is that, well, the problem is that, basically Frank Evans in boat 10 said that the waterline was about 10 feet from that red port light, basically, when their boat left. And even though some people say, some say it might have been because of the angle. Basically, and at first it does seem plausible it might have been because of the angle, but it's very unlikely it was due to the angle. So this is a bit forward as to where boat 10 would have been. And it's kind of hard to see where the waterline was. Advert. However, another survivor in boat 10, Edward Bewley, said that the red port light was underwater when they left. But as you can see here, the red port light is clearly above water here. Basically, even from that perspective, it couldn't have made it look like it was underwater. And it couldn't have been either due to perspective as to why, basically, because the red port light would have still been visible. Many others on the port side said it was the last to leave the port side, so therefore it probably left at a similar time to boat D, basically. However, the launch time of boat 10 hasn't been fully settled on. one thing as well is that basically so Edward Bewley's testimony seems to suggest it left about 25 minutes to half an hour before the ship sank. And with the new evidence, like current research suggesting it left. So I'm currently leaning more towards at the end of 2022. And if it left at 15 minutes before then, and also like in situations like this, you can easily like lose a perspective of lose a perspective of time, basically, because you might because the survivors, many of them probably wouldn't have been checking their watches, and not to mention as well that several watches were off because the ship's clock had been adjusted earlier that evening. And also, in incidents like the Titanic, it seems within many survivor accounts, it's easy to lose a perspective of time and think it was longer or shorter than it actually was, basically. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at Bewley's testimony about it being about 25 minutes to half an hour. It might have seemed twice as long as in reality it actually was, just less than, roughly 15 minutes. Also, many others as well said it was last sleeper. So also, the only contradicting testimony is the Ofgren's testimony, where he said that boat 10 left first, followed by 12, 14, and 16, and the timings seem to suggest that. And when you look at the Ofgren's account, the timings he talked about seem to suggest, because he mentioned he had enough time to throw deck chairs overboard for those in the water, and also have a drink as well after boat 10 left. He was also assigned to boat 10. So basically, and since he was drunk, he might have confused the order of things, instead throwing deck chairs overboard before boat 10. And also, the other thing to keep in mind, is that he was drunk that night, basically, and basically, so not fully reliable because he was drunk, basically. And also, he talked about timings. Well, that actually said that afterwards he threw deck chairs overboard and had some more drinks, basically, before the plunge. But the timing, not sure how many said he threw overboard, but certainly not enough that could have been done in just 5 minutes. Maybe he might have thrown the deck chairs over before, then gone to boat 10, and not the other way around as he claimed. And also, he also said that boat 10 was launched first, followed by 12, then 14, then 16 from the aft port boats. But the problem is that those boats left before 10, basically. It appears that those boats are left before 10. Basically. And therefore, they'd have left before 10. And also the occupants of 12 and 16 mentioned there being a very slight list, and those at 14 mentioned there being a list being, testimonies of those at 14 did mention a port list, but Lowe's testimony seems to imply it was just 6-7 degrees, basically, and not 10 degrees. Not enough to cause a 2.5 foot gap as claimed by others on board boat 10, such as Frank Evans, basically. So therefore, in my opinion, I'd say that the research, even though it's not complete yet, is definitely leaning more towards, I'd say as well, another survivor mentioned that the lights basically, which I think when I recall reading it somewhere as well, that one survivor mentioned the lights, and in brackets said in forward part of the ship, had gone out before, which happened between the loading and lowering of C and D, basically, as boat D was finishing loading. It likely happened. But if boat 10 had left then after a forward set went out, but it was at the original launch time of 1:50. And this meant that they'd have probably gone out as boat 2 was reaching the water, and also would have been out during the loading of boat C, and as boat 4 was finishing lowering, and no one in boat 4 said they'd gone out at that time, and I'm not aware of anyone in boat C who said they'd gone out either. So this can again support the timings basically. Like, well, this can, I'd say as well, would also more point towards boat 10 leaving much later than originally thought, about 2:08. As it explains how some said it was the last boat off, basically. The account that mentioned the lights had gone out in the forward part of the ship before the boats 10 left, and those that claimed that those that claimed the Titanic, those that claimed that water was close to the red port light when their boat left. Basically, if boat 10 was launched at the original time but after the forward set went out, it would have also happened as boat 13, as boat D, as boat 4 and C were loading and lowering, which no one mentioned, but no one at the time aware of mentioned lights going out at that time. And also probably those at boat 2, which again no one in boat 2 mentioned. Okay, so now we've got through the talk about the trim and heel analysis. I'm now going to talk about the V-brake. So I'm going to be using an encyclopedia website called the Titanic Breakup to discuss this. Basically, which mentions about survivor accounts of the breakup of Titanic. So first, basically, the V-brake. So the V-brake theory. This is how the V-brake theory goes. That the Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40, and then afterwards, well, several watertight doors were opened. Basically, then the Titanic water flooded down Scotland Road, and the Titanic sank down more bodily. And then, well, listed heavily over to port, and then the breakup eventually occurred when water reached the bridge. Then the forward end resurfaced and then sank, and the after end rose up, broke again as the middle broke off, and then the after part again rose up and sank again. The after part rose up after the middle sank. However, though, as you can see, immediately, though, the theory just falls apart for physics, basically, as survivors. Basically, the bow was full of water, and the stern wouldn't have had enough force to push the bow up. And plus, as well, the bow wouldn't have been very buoyant either, as almost all air pockets were flooded, basically, and nothing could have caused the bow to suddenly lift up again, like claimed. So basically, it would have not been possible at all. It wouldn't have been possible simply for the bow to rise, because it's filled almost completely with water, and basically, so it couldn't have gone up even very slightly. Plus, as well, if Titanic broke at a low angle, there wouldn't really be enough stress to brake the vessel at an angle. And the force that would cause Titanic to V-brake, which would be like the middle having to flood first, would prevent the bow from sinking down, basically. So that's the description, the explanation of how physics can disapprove of V-brake. So now let's talk about the survivor testimony. So first testimony is from Claire Cameron, one of the Titanic survivors in boat 14, who said the Titanic just broke in two and the ends were sticking up for about 5 minutes. However, something to keep in mind here is the slang used back in that time period. But so where she said the end was sticking up for 5 minutes. Due to slang, basically, where an S was often added to the end, it would mean like that the end was sticking up for 5 minutes, which would therefore be referring to the after part after it went vertical, basically, and remained there for a bit before sinking. Another testimony that didn't really mention it, but said that the vessel's head went down after the break, to refer to the bow. However, though, survivors that I'll soon get to mention that the bow disappeared straight away after the break as well. However, though, the thing to remember is that Titanic didn't break into 2 sections, but 3-4 sections: the bow, stern, and forward and aft tower sections. So where she testified seeing the bow go down, more likely it was just a forward tower dislodging, and she thought it was the back end of the bow going down. The next testimony is from Carrie Chaffee, who described it at the end of the Titanic rapidly. Then, just as it was going down, just before it went down, it right and broke into 3 parts. Then the middle had gone down, and the bow and stern were lifted into the air. Before the vessel had twisted the other way, in the middle was thrown up, and then afterwards the bow went under, and finally the stern went under as well, basically. So that's summary as to what Carrie Chaffee testified. However, she mentioned it being a 3-section break. However, she was in boat 4, which would have had an aft view of the Titanic, and would have therefore seen the aft tower section, which doesn't span the entire width of the ship, basically. So this can be explained that where she said that the middle went down, lifting the bow and stern, she could have mistook the aft tower dislodging as the forward tower broke off with the third funnel falling. Basically, and if the Titanic did rock slightly, which I'm not sure, or at least returning, basically, would have looked like the aft tower, which would be the middle, would be dislodging, while the forward tower, which would be mistaken as the bow, was dislodging, or was like falling off, basically. The third funnel also toppling. It looked like the aft end of the bow heading for the bottom, while the aft tower, or might be referred to as the middle, dislodging, with the stern lifting to port, which would look like it was being lifted up, basically. As well, in this survivor testimony by Sidney Daniels, he mentioned the bows. This would be slang, basically. It'd be bow, basically. So this would be the slang for bow, basically. And not actually. So it'd be slang for bow and not bows. The next survivor is, for the next, another account about her. This is May Futrell, who mentioned that they saw a vessel break into, then a vessel's bow was pointing downward, dipped and turned up again, then arrived and sank with the stern, basically. So that's what she had described. However, as said earlier, the bow couldn't have resurfaced. As well, May Futrell as well mentioned that as soon as she got onto deck, so she'd escaped in boat 9, and as soon as she got onto deck, Titanic began to list to port. If this was at 1:13, however, this would probably be the 10 minutes too early bit, basically, because in my theory of port list begins at 1:23, as it was slighter, and it's very slight list until a while later, as recalled by several survivors. And no one else at boat 9 mentioned there being a port list, but instead there being no list, basically. So she could have been referring to the back end of the bow, or the forward tower dislodging and breaking off. Basically. but it also contradicts those that said the bow went under immediately. The next testimony is from Jean Hippick, who talked about an explosion and the ship splitting open and the bow rising up in the air as the middle sank. However, she was in the same boat as Carrie Chaffee, basically, so where she talked about the steamer sinking towards the middle, this could have been the aft tower dislodging, and the forward tower dislodging could have looked like, or the forward tower breaking off, it could have looked like the bow, or at least the back end of the bow. So again, that can be easily explained. The next one is from Carla Jensen, who mentioned that they'd heard an incredible crash and the Titanic, the ship broke in two and both parts rose up into the sky and sank. However, this time I don't think it'll be a case of it being slang, basically, because she mentioned both parts, basically. The stone would have rose up after the breakup into the sky, like not into the sky, such like rising up to a vertical position, which could have been what she meant by the sky. The forward tower dislodging, basically, would only, the very back end forward tower could have only lifted up very slightly, basically, and not to the extent of like lifting up into the sky, and probably also mistook as the back end of the bow. So fortunately, this account, like but mentioning the bow rising up into the sky, can't really be explained, I don't think, but could have mistook other bits of debris breaking off as it. This testimony as well mentions that the forward end of the talks about that the forward end of the Titanic had sank as the vessel broke in two. However, the bow would have gone under before break, but however, though, one thing to consider though is that several survivors testified the lights going out in sections, basically, so they could have mistook the middle section going out as the initial break, and when they said the forward end sank, could have mistook it as like thought that due to the lights going out of section, the vessel was starting to break apart, and when the bow went under, thought it had gone under, or alternatively again could have mistook forward tower breaking off as the back end of the bow. This testimony here from Bertha Lehman mentioned that the front part of the Titanic went under first after the break, but could have mistook this again as a forward tower breaking off and sinking, and where she mentioned that then the middle sank, could have mistook the aft tower as the middle section, or like saw the aft tower and thought it was the middle section, basically. So the aft tower likely, in my theory, is damaged on the surface but doesn't come off till the descent, basically. So more likely it was damaged, basically, and then, and from some perspectives, some might have thought it had broken off, basically, though it could also be explained the new lights out. Though for those that said it broke in front of fore funnel in a way could be explained with new lights out theory, because the aft lights or the end of the middle lights and start of the aft lights are right underneath the fore funnel. But this survivor testimony that said that the middle sank afterwards could have mistook the aft tower dislodging or the back end of the forward tower and like been referring to that as like the middle, when saying that the last part of the vessel was above the water. Well, since the aft tower was dislodged, it might not have been visible, and then the stern once the stern rose up as well, the aft tower would have been completely submerged. The next testimony is from Percy Oxenham, who mentioned that the Titanic parted and the hulks drifted apart before they went under, and that they seemed to rise out of water. However, I'd say, in my opinion, this could again be explained with the slang, where he mentioned that the big ship parted and the hulks drifted apart. He could have meant the hulk drifting apart into several pieces. And then where he said the halves seemed to rise out of water, could have meant the after half rising out of the water. Another testimony that mentioned the bow going down as the vessel broke, basically. Therefore, so more likely they're like mistook the forward tower as the back end of the bow. Another survivor was Susie Webber, who mentioned that the lights went out deck after, by decks, and then water got to the engine room. Afterwards, water got to an engine room, and an explosion occurred, and the vessel broke in the middle. But something about her camera that she mentioned stern rose high in the air, but the bow rose less high. Well, she mentioned it broke in the middle, basically, but simply wasn't specific enough as to the middle, basically, because it could reasonably, another enthusiast told me it could reasonably refer to either forward or after the third funnel, and the forward tower separation was just after the third funnel. The stern rising high in the air would have been it going vertical, on the bow rising less high would have probably been a forward tower dislodging, which might have looked like the back end of the bow breaking off. Both survivors Alfred White and Thomas Whitley both mentioned the forward end going down, basically. But again, probably mistook it as, but might have mistook it as the back end of the aft tower and thought that was the back end of the bow, basically. Richard Norris Williams, another survivor, mentioned the bow suddenly began to rise out of the water until to the depths were out of water again. However, he mentioned this more being at the start of the final plunge rather than the actual break, but might have confused lights going out in sections as the break. Well, as discussed earlier in the previous stream, the rising of a deck wouldn't actually be rising, but more like vessel rocking. Briefly afterwards, from starboard to port briefly, trying to stabilize the start of the plunge before the plunge, well, just as the plunge was starting, which would have lifted the deck up a bit, basically, creating the illusion of it, or making it seem like it was rising, accounting for these, for Richard Norris Williams. final survivor was from Thomas Dillon. He mentioned that he was on his testimony, however, is in third person, basically. Well, he mentioned that he was standing, that it mentioned that he was standing on the poop deck, which was on a slope of about 60 degrees. And the second explosion came, and the bow seemed to bob up and break clean like, it seemed to break clean like a piece of carrot, is what his testimony said roughly, basically. So his testimony is, he stood on the poop, which was at a slope of about 60 degrees, and was in time to see a second explosion. The bow seemed to bob up and then break clean like a piece of a carrot. Well, in another account, he mentioned 4 funnels seemed to cant off towards him when the stern went down. However, again, the bow can't rise post-break. So during the plunge, however, the forward 2 funnels would have fallen, quite submerged, and probably a third funnel as well. Basically, when they fell, they might have bobbed up slightly, creating the illusion of the bow bobbing up and breaking off like a piece of carrot, which therefore accounts for these testimonies. Now we're going to have a look at the inquiries. Well, we're going to have a quick look around the inquiries as well for the testimonies that mentioned. Oh, so Titanic survivor George Simmons was in boat 1. Basically, he mentioned that that he heard 2 sharp explosions from the Titanic, and that then the Titanic took a top cant and the stern came well out of the water. In this part of the testimony, he mentioned it's righted itself without the bow. In my estimation, she must have broken in half. He said that vessel had righted without the bow, but stern righted without the bow. Basically, this means therefore the bow must have gone down straight away post-break. Another survivor, Thomas Ranger, said that the after part came back on a level keel and the forward end seemed to break off. This means therefore that again the bow had gone under straight away during the break, basically. So the final testimony that I'll have a look at that I'm going to talk about, which mentions this. Was Frank Evans. He mentioned that the foremost part was gone, basically. This means that the foremost part must have disappeared straight away. Well, his testimony therefore indicates that the foremost part again straight away disappeared in the break, basically. And the stern broke off as this happened. So in summary, my thoughts about V-break are that it does attempt to explain some testimonies, however, about the bow rising. However, it doesn't follow physics, basically, and also it doesn't account for those at the inquiries who talked about the bow going under straight away post-break and not at all resurfacing. And also about those that said the bow resurfaced might have mistook it with a forward tower dislodging and breaking off and the aft tower dislodging. So these testimonies can therefore be easily explained. It also doesn't account for physics, basically. But yeah, it tries to account for some testimonies. Also, so people know, I do not at all believe in a V rate, just so people know. And yeah, because it doesn't account for physics and doesn't account for all the testimonies, or consider the testimony that talks about the barrel resurfacing might have mistook it as a full tower. But anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the stream. And yeah, there's going to be a premiere out in a few days. But yeah, bye everyone.